Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of Co-Water International, the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, or APF Canada, would like to welcome you all to our Canada ASEAN MSME Trade Promotion Workshop. So today, our speakers and experts will discuss Canada's approach in the inclusion of micro, small, and medium enterprises, or MSMEs, in its free trade agreements, and how ASEAN member states may integrate similar approaches in your respective MSME and trade policies. My name is Justin Kwan, and I'm a senior program manager at APF Canada, and will be moderating today's discussion. Before I begin today's discussion, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. So please note that this webinar is currently being recorded and may be posted for viewing by ASEAN member state officials who were unable to attend today. Second, this webinar will be conducted in English. So to ask questions to the panelists, please use the chat function located at the bottom of your screen, and we will collect these questions and use the Q&A portion of our session to answer them. So until then, please kindly keep your cameras and microphones off. If you could go to the next slide, please. To make this session possible today, I would like to make a few acknowledgements. First, I would like to acknowledge that this technical assistance is funded by Global Affairs Canada through the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development. The Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada conducted this technical assistance activity on behalf of Co-Water International and the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. So we'd like to thank them for funding this very timely initiative. Second, and aligned with some of the topics we will discuss today, we do wish to acknowledge that the places Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And although we are convening virtually from different parts of Canada, I would like to acknowledge that the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada's head office is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to Canada's Indigenous peoples for their stewardship of the lands on which we live, work, and play, and we at APF Canada are collectively committed to the process of reconciliation. If you could go to the next slide, please. So today we are pleased to present three main presentations from our team at APF Canada on MSME trade promotion from our speakers. And this includes a presentation on Canada's approach of promoting MSME participation in trade through FTAs, an overview of Canadian policies and programs that promote MSME participation in trade, and finally, an overview of the trade barriers and challenges by MSMEs led by underrepresented groups with a particular focus on women and Indigenous peoples. So we'll open today's workshop with some brief remarks from Dr. Anastasia Yefimtseva, our Program Manager of Business Asia at the Foundation. And then we'll go into a presentation first from Ms. Sylvia Rosario and Mr. David Hamilton, our trade and policy promotion consultants, who will provide an overview of Canada's free trade agreements and inclusive trade agenda. The second presentation, delivered by Ms. Rachel Gurney, our research scholar in Business Asia, will focus on Canadian policies and programs that promote and encourage MSME participation in trade. And then finally, our third presentation will be delivered by Ms. Stephanie Perrin, our gender equity and social inclusion specialist. And that presentation will focus on key barriers in trade for MSMEs led by underrepresented groups and the Canadian approach to addressing these barriers. So throughout these presentations, we do invite you to submit your questions through the Zoom chat for our speakers, which will then be addressed during the Q&A. So after these four presentations, we'll have a very short 10-minute break for the attendees. And during that break, we'd like to ask you all to fill out a very short survey about what you've learned during this workshop. After the break, we'll then return and go over some resources on promoting MSME's inclusive trade, followed by context setting for our Q&A session from Anastasia. And then we'll go into the Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes approximately, and then wrap up with some closing remarks. And so with all of that said, I'd like to now pass it to Dr. Anastasia Yefimtseva to start us off with a discussion on Canada's FTAs. So Anastasia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Dr. Anastasia Yefimtseva, and I would like to introduce you a bit to the context setting before we get into the meat of today's session. So in the next slide, we would see a few ideas of the factors that are shaping Canada's perspectives. So Canada's negotiating position is shaped by multiple factors that are internal to Canada, such as the market conditions. What are the economic conditions that encompass could be potentially domestic GDP growth, there could be unemployment rate and other factors that the government considers when they go and negotiate, as well as national interests, be there security interests or economic interests. Lastly, domestic politics is very important in terms of the fact that the government represents multiple communities, as we would see gender, Indigenous communities, and business interests. And often the negotiating position is driven with the objective in mind to diversify and strengthen global supply chains and expand trade and economic relations. So the main goals of, in a way, a free trade agreement is to minimize business risk or ensure that the businesses from both all of the countries incorporated in the free trade agreement are protected, to reduce red tape for corporations, meaning any government regulations or standards that are not consistent and make it more difficult for businesses to invest across the border, and protects domestic firms by leveling the playing field or making sure that domestic firms are treated the same when they go abroad, or can expect similar conditions of the treatment and can learn from those free trade clauses how they're going to be treated. And the next slide, we will also see the evolution of this perspective. So small and medium enterprises are being increasingly integrated, as you will learn from today's presentation, into free trade agreements. So they either are standalone chapters and they're included across the agreement in different levels. So in terms of important provisions, increasingly we're looking at the environmental provisions, labor provisions, intellectual property protections, as well as governance, Indigenous people rights, and governance issues. CPTPP is one of the key clauses, or key free trade agreements, as well as other previous trade agreement clauses that could serve as a precedent for future negotiations, meaning whenever you negotiate something and put it into writing, you will have an objective to follow some of the clauses that have been already signed to avoid inconsistency between the past way and past treatment of trade agreement position for the future standard rules and setting of the future agreements. So in the final slide for me for today, for this section, and I'll expand on it later, we can see a leadership sentiment based on the PTs. So we have traditional ideas and interests focused on promotion of economic interests, and this is based from Prime Minister Trudeau 2021 statement, noting that we should look at improvement of the supply chains, export diversification, and creation of new jobs for the purposes of economic diversification. So this is critical for a free trade agreement. But also we're seeing this novel discourse, just looking at the Prime Minister Trudeau 2021 statement at a similar time. He also says that we need to address the systematic inequalities and disparities that have been faced by specific underrepresented groups, such as women, Indigenous peoples, Blacks and racialized Canadians, as well as newcomers, faith-based communities, persons with disabilities, and LGBTQ. So with that, also previous Minister of Trade, Francois Philippe Champagne in 2017 has noted specific groups such as women, Indigenous people, youth, and small and medium-sized businesses as groups that should benefit from the free trade agreement, and to maintain, in a way, an open dialogue with the civil society to ensure their inclusion. And Chrystia Freeland in 2017, when she was Minister of Foreign Affairs, has said that there is a tie between free trade and equitable domestic policy. And with that, I want to move to the next slide and start introduction of Ms. Sylvia Rosario, who will introduce her work on free trade agreements, as well as the team's work on free trade agreements. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Anastasia, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Let's begin the discussion on Canadian FTAs. When Canada first started negotiating FTAs, the main priority was liberalizing trade and establishing economic cooperation with similar and geographically proximate markets. Gradually, Canada started taking social and environmental issues into account while negotiating FTAs. Next click, please. Canada's trade policy has evolved in the last decade to extend the benefits and opportunities of trade agreements to more people, especially historically underrepresented groups such as MSMEs, women, and Indigenous peoples. In 2017, Canada signed the Joint Declaration on Trade and MSMEs and Women's Economic Empowerment at the 11th WTO Ministerial Conference. Next. The following year, Canada decided to apply a Gender-Based Analysis Plus or GBA Plus framework for negotiating chapters in the Canada-Mercosur FTA. We will discuss this in detail later in the presentation. Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, which is Canada's RTA with the European Union, received its Gender and MSME recommendation this year. Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP chapter on MSME was an achievement for Canada in 2018. Next. In 2019, the modernization process of Canada-Chile FTA began and ended with the inclusion of a chapter on gender. Canada-Israel FTA also got modernized in the same year and incorporated chapters on MSME and gender. In 2020, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, established an MSME advisory group through its chapter on MSME. Simultaneously, Inclusive Trade Action Group, or ITAG, members including Chile, New Zealand, Mexico, Canada, and Colombia, initiated the Global Trade and Gender Agreement. In 2021, Canada endorsed the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Agreement along with Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan. This endorsement would encourage and facilitate international trade and experience sharing with, between, and among Indigenous peoples throughout the Asia-Pacific. At the beginning of 2022, Canada announced its intention to modernize the Canada-Ukraine FTA. Now the question is, what will be some upcoming trade priorities for Canada? Can you please release our first polling question? Can you please select some of the trade priorities which you think might be important for Canada in the future? Can everyone see the polling question? Can you please take one or more of the answers? Thank you. So the answers are in. Let's see how close our assumptions were in the next slide. So this year, Canada plans to develop a model chapter on trade and Indigenous peoples. Next click, please. While also focusing on environmental assessments and gender-based analysis to negotiate FTAs. The formulation of joint activities under CETA to promote Indigenous peoples' participation in trade is another agenda for Canada this year. Also, in the upcoming 12th WTO Ministerial Conference, Canada plans to issue a statement on gender. Trade policy specialists presume that Canada's inclusive and progressive agendas will keep evolving in this decade to become more transparent and gender responsive. Also, educating and enabling the target groups in unlocking the benefits of trade would remain a key priority for the government this year. Meanwhile, domestic policy priorities and international engagement will play pivotal roles in the upcoming FTA negotiation architecture. Next slide, please. This table draws a broad comparison among the MSME chapters in the 3 Canadian Regional Trade Agreements, or RTAs. The CPTPP and CUSMA both have dedicated MSME chapters. The CETA does not contain a chapter but has a joint committee recommendation on MSME. All 3 RTAs highly prioritize information sharing with MSMEs so that businesses are aware of the provisions within the RTAs, which might help them access the benefits of international trade. Both CPTPP and CUSMA MSME chapters established a committee to support MSME participation in international trade. CETA does not contain similar provisions. CPTPP does not mention sectoral collaboration to promote MSME participation, while both CUSMA and CETA identify sectoral cooperation as a way forward to boost MSME participation. CUSMA MSME chapter has provisions on showcasing MSME owned by underrepresented groups, while the other 2 RTAs do not contain similar provisions. CETA's Joint Committee recommendation, being the latest among the 3, mentions offering COVID-19 recovery assistance to MSMEs. Lastly, all the clauses mentioned in MSME chapters in CPTPP and CUSMA are not subject to dispute settlement. CETA has no such clause. Apart from the chapters on MSMEs, all 3 RTAs contain provisions relevant to MSMEs throughout the agreement. In our report, we have highlighted them all, but due to the time limitation, we will only discuss the CPTPP in details for today. Next slide, please. The CPTPP is the latest RTA negotiated by Canada with inclusive and progressive agendas. Also, the 4 ASEAN countries, Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam have already either ratified or signed the agreement. The product-specific rules of origin allow full accumulation, which means that when materials originating or produced in a CPTPP country are used to produce good in another country, the materials are treated as originating goods and are subject to preferential tariff rates. Also, the new and improved provisions regarding self-certification and simplified paperwork might help SMEs in claiming origin by reducing administrative cost and procedural delays. The RTA encourages creating preferential access to government procurements for MSMEs. The parties are required to provide facilitation to MSMEs to explore government procurement and ensure that the process, including the criteria for eligibility, is transparent. CPTPP recommends establishing common rules for cross-border e-commerce between members by removing barriers for MSME in digital trade and enabling freer flow of cross-border data. CPTPP mandates each party to adopt or maintain expedited procedures for express shipments while maintaining appropriate customs control and selection. It is also recommended that each party factors in the impact of customs duties on MSMEs before setting up the cutoff amount. Next slide, please. Click. The agreement recommends capacity building training for MSMEs so that they can tackle issues related to intellectual property rights. The RTA instructs parties to undertake regulatory impact assessments when developing regulations that might affect MSMEs. Parties are recommended to collaborate and design joint activities to facilitate MSME access to trade by engaging relevant public, private, and multilateral institutions. All CPTPP parties agreed to establish a committee on competitiveness and business facilitation. This committee will devise strategies to enhance the overall competitiveness of each economy by promoting greater MSME participation in regional supply chains. Next slide, please. We would like to wrap up the discussion related to RTAs by comparing the chapters on environment. CETA asks each party to remove the barriers to trade or investment in goods and services of particular relevance for climate change mitigation, especially trade or investment in renewable energy goods and ancillary services. None of the three RTAs contain any environmental provisions specifically related to MSMEs. Instead, all of them rely on the parties to domestically regulate their own private sector's environmental practices. All three agreements encourage parties to facilitate public awareness regarding environmental law and compliance procedures. CPTPP and CUSMA encourage public-private collaboration and voluntary mechanisms to boost environmental responsible practices in the private sector. Both CPTPP and CUSMA recommends the parties undertake conservation efforts to minimize unsustainable fishing practices without disrupting the livelihood of fishing communities and indigenous peoples. Lastly, CPTPP and CUSMA acknowledge the role of traditional or indigenous knowledge in biodiversity conservation, while CETA does not contain similar provisions. Next slide, please. So Canada has 12 bilateral FTAs, but today we will only focus on 3 of the most recently negotiated or modernized FTAs. We have discussed each FTA in detail in our report, but we will limit our discussion to the broad comparison table for today. The Canada-Israel FTA is the only bilateral FTA that contains a dedicated chapter on MSME. The Canada-Israel and Canada-Chile FTAs were modernized in 2019 and each got dedicated chapters on trade and gender. Canada-Israel and Canada-Colombia FTA identified e-commerce as a lever of growth for MSMEs, while only Canada-Israel FTA has intellectual property provisions for MSMEs. Canada-Colombia FTA is the only FTA with government procurement provisions for MSMEs and trade-related cooperation. The FTA also requires each party to assess the impact of the agreement on small and medium businesses. Next slide, please. For the very first time, the Government of Canada used the Gender-Based Analysis Plus or GBA Plus framework in negotiating an FTA with Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, the 4 members of the Mercosur trade bloc. GBA Plus is an analytical framework that is used to determine the impacts of domestic and international policies, programs, initiatives, organizations, and activities on diverse group of women, men, and non-binary people. The GBA Plus analysis revealed 4 key findings. First, Negotiating a level playing field and increased predictability for goods would reduce fixed costs for MSMEs, including women and indigenous-owned businesses, as fixed costs are a higher percentage of their expenditure due to the smaller sizes. Second, in 2017, women made up 55% of the Canadian service sector, and the majority of the MSMEs in this sector were owned by women. The GBA Plus recommends the inclusion of targeted provisions across certain chapters. Third, the analysis recommends that incorporation of gender-responsive provisions in chapters such as employment, labor, gender, MSMEs, and indigenous peoples. Fourth, the GBA Plus reports an absence of gender parity and diversity in dispute settlement procedures. The findings recommend including more women from the Canadian legal sector as panelists in the dispute settlement courts. Before ending the first part of the discussion, let's do a quick comparison between Canada and ASEAN safety negotiation frameworks. Can we please release the second polling question? Please identify some common areas between Canada and ASEAN FTA negotiation frameworks. So before revealing the correct answers, can we please release the last polling question? Please identify the chapters which are often included in Canadian FTAs but are yet to included in ASEAN FTAs. Next slide, please. According to a comparative analysis done by Global Affairs Canada, there are more in common than differences between Canada and ASEAN safety negotiation frameworks. There are currently 16 areas of commonalities against 6 areas of differences. However, gender, environment, and labor will remain priority areas for Canada in this decade to foster an inclusive and progressive trade environment. I'd like to wrap up the first part of the discussion on Canada's trade agreement and hand it over to the next presenter, Mr. David Hamilton, who worked as a trade policy and promotion consultant on this project, and he will provide more context to the discussion on trade agreements. Thank you everyone for your engagement throughout the presentation.
So good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, and just good day. I understand I'm all the way in the easternmost part of Canada, where it's just almost 11:30, but it's still Wednesday. Some of you are on Thursday yet, but I'm glad to be joining you here. One clarification point that I have to make is I also work for the province of Nova Scotia, which is the easternmost province, and about 6 weeks ago, I was named as the provincial lead for the ASEAN negotiations. So if any of you are traveling to Ottawa for the negotiations, it's a possibility that you might encounter me. But I'm very pleased to be joining you here today. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So we were already talking about differences and commonalities between Canada and the Asian countries. And so one of the things we thought would be useful was actually to give a comparison of some rankings of the ease of doing business, as well as other practices. You know, I have also worked for the WTO, so I'm very familiar with this region. And so there's a lot of variety, I guess, on these rankings. So Canada normally does pretty well on some of them, 23. But if you look at Singapore, we still have yet to catch up to Singapore here. So there's a mix. Like Thailand is also ahead of Canada on ease of doing business, and you can see the same thing coming from the results of the World Bank or the Global Economic Forum Index, which looks at a variety of things, whether it's registering a business or the quality of the court systems. All these things are considered. So this ranking is quite thorough, but it gives us an idea of where Canada stands. Unlike what is the, I guess, the standard or the mode, if you will, in the ASEAN countries, Canada doesn't have a single ministry for trade and commerce. So trade is part of Global Affairs Canada, which is, of course, one of the financiers of this project. But we have the Ministry of Science, Innovation, and Economic Development here in Canada, which used to be the Ministry of Industry, but they've renamed it to sort of renew it. So that it's kind of a joint shared file, and there are agencies that are shared, or some of them have agencies of dedicated trade for both areas. And there are other areas where Canada somewhat diverges from Asia. So we looked at business networks and stuff like that. But to give you an idea of basically the Canadian evolution, if you will, of its trade regime, particularly its trade promotion regime. It was very fortunate to be right next door to the United States. And we were the first advanced economy to gain free trade access to the United States. And of course, we spoke English. We also have French as one of our main languages. We also have indigenous languages. But we're a common law country. And as I said, we share a border with the United States. So this had very much created a sort of situation where we had a very massive uptake in our trade performance after the first trade agreements with the United States. And now we have a new one with CUSMA. And so we're yet to see the results of all that. But it's very important to remember that Canada is a very big country with kind of major pockets of population. The largest component of that is actually in the central area of Canada, around the Great Lakes, Toronto, Montreal, they're all there. And a lot of our industrial capacity is there too, but a huge chunk of our country also has, population, and it has a lot of capacity as well. So it's, as I mentioned, it's also important to remember Canada is a federation. So when you negotiate with Canada, although you don't meet the provincial representatives, your federal counterparts in the negotiation immediately have to come and talk to the provincial representatives, and one of those provincial representatives will be me. Next slide, please. So as Sylvia already went through, there is some commonalities, a lot of commonalities, and there are also some areas of divergence on the trade agreements signed by ASEAN and by Canada. Overall, if you look at things like whether it's TBT or rules of origin, things are highly beneficial to MSMEs, stuff like advanced ruling, which is very important. There's a lot of commonality there. And so there's a lot to work on. The other thing I'd also think it's important to mention that just because a chapter is not there doesn't mean that the provisions contained in those chapters doesn't appear in someplace else. So for ASEAN and some of the countries there, they have economic and cooperation chapters, which might not specifically address those issues, but from their perspective are meant to be the equivalent. And so there is some equivalency between the provisions separated by chapters. So it's very important to take that in balance with everything. The newer FTAs, we're seeing a greater degree of cooperation on SMEs. There's a very, very, very new emphasis being placed on SMEs and MSMEs, however you want to define them. So the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand agreement includes commitments for research and capacity building. And I'd also mention that Canada's position has evolved over time, as you saw in the initial presentation from Sylvia, that it initially wasn't there in NAFTA, and it's come in, and it's actually growing more important with every subsequent negotiation. So the provisions are evolving, and they continue to evolve. So just assessing what we've as a country have done in the past is a good basis, but you should also keep an eye on the ball of where things might go. Next slide, please. So as part of this project, as I previously mentioned, I worked for the WTO, and I actually worked on the joint initiative on the micro, small, and medium enterprises, the WTO. At the time when I was there, it got up to 90 countries. It may have increased since then. But one of the things we discovered when we were doing that, it wasn't really a productive exercise to ask the members to give them a survey and say, can you get this back to us in about 2 months' time and give us all the information? Fortunately, because it was the WTO, though, we had this wealth of all these trade policy review reports, all the free trade agreements. And so we took machine learning and we actually began to compile those into tables and produce reports on this. So our own effort here today with the forum is that we actually had that data ready to go. So we were able to access it from the WTO website and able to use that to do the analysis for your work. So it's quite thorough, and it was highly beneficial and useful. The WTO on this data prepared a compendium report that was very thorough and gives you all this information, a lot of interpretation on the provisions. They have continued to maintain the database. I think it's updated annually. So any new free trade agreement from ASEAN or from Canada, all the provisions, anything that mentions a MSME, doesn't have to be a MSME chapter, it could be a mention of it in commerce or in rules of origin, it will be added into the list and profiled. So that we found to be a very tremendous tool, and as you can see, was very beneficial in providing you the results that you're getting from this report. Next slide, please. So there are some themes in the provision table that I thought, maybe should be addressed, and they were already talked about in the presentation. So one of the big ones is cooperation, and frequently what you'll see in the MSME chapters is the provisions that establish committees that are to meet. There's no application of dispute settlement, so these chapters are mainly meant to sort of facilitate MSME's concerns in conjunction with the other areas, whether it's technical barriers to trade, trade facilitation, or other issues. Of course, one of those areas is, of course, e-commerce. E-commerce, you'll frequently see mentions of MSMEs. And so to make sure that everything is conforming and that this is benefiting the MSMEs of both sides, that's the purposes of committees in the MSMEs chapters. Same thing with IP. There's a very, very strong emphasis on access to information. Another project I worked on at the WTO was the WTO's Open Trade Data Initiative, and this was very beneficial for the MSMEs because it provided them data and information. And another UN organization later took that data and developed something called the Global Trade Help Desk, which is this UN version of a global tariff finder, but it doesn't just give you tariffs, it gives you all the UN WTO data on non-tariff measures, anything they identified. You type in what country you're in, where you want to sell to, and what the HS code of the product you want to sell, and you'll get everything immediately ready to go, so long as a WTO member. And of course, there are other things in there. You'll see frequently exceptions made from SMEs in government procurement. Many countries view SMEs as kind of a special group that have to have a special allowance in government procurement. So you'll see thresholds or other things meant to be inclusive to make sure governments can at least spend money on their MSMEs to make sure that they're included in the government procurement process. And something that's evolving is to make sure that MSMEs, that there's no bias towards the MSMEs. So in some cases, you might see most favored nation being applied in these cases. And the final one is the regulatory considerations. It's particularly important to TBT. The WTO, this is one that was brought forward. It's frequently referred to as the small lens. So when countries bring in new regulations, they make assessments based on environment, based on health. One of the new ones that's coming up is increasingly becoming more important to trade is the idea to make that assessment based from the SME or MSME level. So this frequently is also known as the small lens. So you're starting to see things here. Now, all these are meant to be discussed by the committees if the committees are empowered to in that agreement. With that, I guess we're on to the next slide. So as I said, Canada's approach is evolving. And that's true about many countries and ASEAN and other countries too, like the European Union. One thing I think it's important to note is that there's no universal definition of what is a MSME or an SME, but everyone has one. So obviously this is a point of concern for all trading countries or regions, but we've yet to get to the point. So for example, what is medium in Canada might be large in other parts of the world. So there's always that notice. And some countries use employment to define what is a MSME. Some countries use cash flow or other sort of balance sheet items like assets. Some countries use a combination. So you'll see that all over the place. The other thing I think it's very important to remember when we're talking about MSMEs, SMEs, or even other issues like gender or indigenous, is that RTAs are not pieces of public property, private property. They're public. They're pieces of public legislation. As such, there is a need to make sure that all these groups have the ability to access and to benefit from the free trade agreements, as well as to be protected from any negative consequences. So that leads me to that second point about MSMEs benefiting. And the final thing is that there's this evolving need that everyone recognizes that everyone has this problem. As such, it's better to cooperate because there's no way someone's going to be unilaterally able to solve their MSME or SME problem alone on trade. So there's this need to cooperate, which is reflected in the chapters of these agreements. So with that, I'm done with my presentation. So it's time for Rachel Gurney to take you a little further on our work.
Hi, good afternoon, or good morning, good evening. My name is Rachel Gurney. I'm a junior research scholar at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in the Business Asia Pillar. Today, I'm going to be discussing the programs and policies that different levels of Canadian government offer to help MSMEs to grow and to expand globally. Next slide. Here's a brief overview of what I will be discussing in my presentation. First, I'm going to go over the Canadian government system and provide some context on the division of powers. Then I'm going to talk about how the government regulates business and trade and provide a brief overview of the types of programs and policies offered by different levels of government, as well as those by non-governmental organizations. These programs are going to be broken down by their core features to inspire possible replication and adoption by ASEAN member states. Next slide. In Canada, there are 3 levels of government: the federal, provincial, or territorial, and multiple municipal governments within each. The Constitution divides legislative powers between the federal and provincial governments. However, provinces must work collaboratively with the federal government to create mutually advantageous policies and programs. Next slide. Divided powers are typically conferred to only one level of government. However, business falls into a bit of gray area because the regulation of trade and business is officially administered by the federal government. While provinces have their own interests in these areas, they must work collaboratively with the federal government to promote their trade and business interests. As a result, each level of government has its own interests that they can respond to through creating new ministries, departments, or secretaries. At the federal level, there is the Minister of International Trade, Export Promotion, and Small Business and Economic Development. Meanwhile, in the province of British Columbia, there is the Minister of Jobs, Economic Recovery, and Innovation. There are clearly overlapping themes between these ministerial titles. However, the differences highlight what each government values at the time. Both levels of government almost always have a minister focused on the economy, but the focus of ministry mandates can shift over time, as you can see with the previous titles. Next slide, please. Each level of government has different objectives regarding MSME development. Therefore, the programs they administer also differ. The federal government tends to focus on financing and export development. The first type of program that you'll find are loans with flexible repayment plans and lower interest rates. These operate differently than traditional bank loans. An example of that is the Business Development Canada's Small Business Loan Program. It offers up to $100,000 with a 60-month repayment period and a more favorable interest rate set by the business's personal credit history. And unlike a traditional bank loan, there's no personal collateral taken for security. These are very good for MSMEs because they're more accessible and flexible than traditional financing. And because there's no collateral taken, they have reduced levels of risk. The next type of financing program are grants. These are non-repayable funds with often a specific objective in mind. For example, Canada's Innovation, Science and Economic Development Department offers the Canada Digital Adoption Program. This program offers up to $2,400 for businesses to adopt e-commerce technologies and digitalize their businesses. E-commerce is a growing sector that can help businesses drive sales and expand. However, the adoption of new technologies can be expensive and very daunting to small businesses. This grant helps offset that risk by providing them with the funds to adopt new technology. The other type of programs that the Canadian federal government tends to focus on are for export development. So Can Export SME program offers up to $50,000 in funding for MSMEs to seek out export opportunities in the form of trade missions, consultancy services, and market research. Finally, there are risk assessment or management programs. Export Development Canada offers an array of insights on international trade trends and economic risk assessments. They also offer affordable credit insurance for businesses to help them protect their exports when they start expanding globally. Next slide. Canada is a geographically very large country, so there are varying economic interests in each region. The federal government has created 7 regional development agencies that work closely with provincial and federal government and businesses to fuel economic growth. Each RDA has a federal cabinet minister assigned to it, and they have high discretion to create their own programs that foster economic development suitable for their region. All RDAs have some level of MSME focus, and they have different programs that align with that. First, there's the Business Scale-Up and Productivity Program that offers low-interest loans. This program prioritizes MSMEs focused on clean technology, food processing, healthcare technology, and low-emission vehicles. This program is offered by Pacific Can, Prairies Can, and CED. The next program that I want to highlight is the Jobs and Growth Fund. This program offers funding to support the adoption of clean technology and help foster a transition to a green economy for growing businesses. This program is offered by CanNor, FedDev Ontario, and FedNor. Next slide, please. Canadian provinces also have a high level of discretion to create their own cabinet positions and programs to best respond to their economic interests. Most provinces currently have focused their ministerial mandates and departments on post-pandemic economic recovery. However, almost all of them still have a mandate focus on MSME development. Every province has a clear direct reference to MSMEs in their current mandate, except for Manitoba, New Brunswick, and Quebec. These provinces have more indirect references to MSMEs in the form of their existing programs and ministerial titles. The programs that the provincial governments offer tend to focus more on credits, tax benefits, and grants. Meanwhile, the federal government focuses on export development and financing. Provinces also have the ability to ease regulatory barriers and make doing business easier. For example, Alberta's Export Expansion Program offers financial assistance for travel costs to facilitate international trade. BC's Small Business Support Branch offers a series of programs and advisory services to help MSMEs get connected to funding and expand their businesses. And Ontario's Invest Ontario program helps facilitate trade missions and offers export guarantees. Next slide, please. The third type of programs that we see are from non-governmental organizations. NGOs play a key role in the development of MSMEs because they can provide tools and resources to facilitate entrepreneurship, especially for marginalized groups such as women and Indigenous people. They facilitate civil society partnerships between government and business. They also can act as policy advocates for MSMEs who often lack the resources and knowledge to advocate their needs to the government. For example, the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, or CFIB, is a nonprofit organization that's devoted to promoting the interests of small businesses with policymakers. They advocate for things such as regulation improvements and lowering the barriers to entry for small businesses. Next slide. NGOs operate very similarly to the government programs. They tend to focus, however, on creating industry connection and education. Some NGOs provide funding to help aid with scaling up and expanding globally, oftentimes at a smaller scale than the federal government. CFIB offers banking, payroll, and shipping software at a discount to MSMEs who are members of their organization. This helps offset the day-to-day operating costs so businesses can focus their resources on expansion or growth. Most NGOs offer some sort of education service or workshop for free or at a low cost. For example, there's Startup Canada's Startup Women program, which is a free month-long workshop that helps connect participants with industry experts. They also offer workshops, panels, and one-on-one sessions that on a variety of subjects pertaining to domestic and international development. The Trade Accelerator program is an example of a paid program. The workshop is subsidized by the federal government to help MSMEs engage with panels, one-on-one sessions, and a series of e-learning courses. This program is focused on export development and building trade connections. NGOs can also offer business services, business advising services for free or a low cost. For example, Small Business BC offers an e-learning platform with free courses on export processes, work safety, and other business-related topics. They also offer advisory services for exports, market growth, and accounting. Next slide. So, in summary, MSMEs require a collaborative effort from different levels of government, NGOs, and civil society to grow. no single program or policy is enough to facilitate growth. The overlapping objectives of these different programs and policies can help MSMEs develop and expand, as they can tap into many different resources at once. MSMEs face specific barriers to startup and expansion that government programs and policies can help mitigate. Most programs help MSMEs by providing them with funding opportunities in the form of low-interest flexible loans or non-repayable grants. MSMEs also tend to be highly risk adverse, which can also stunt expansion. Funding for risky activities such as trade, related travel, adopting new technology, funding for these types of activities can help mitigate those risks and allow MSMEs to actually engage with things that can help them expand. MSMEs also face challenges when it comes to administrative costs. Many of these programs help simply by reducing the amount of administrative work necessary to access funding, but they also provide businesses with simple resources to help make that day-to-day administration easier. In Canada, the federal and provincial governments are expanding their focus on MSME development. More money and more resources are being allocated to help MSMEs grow and expand, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. MSMEs play an integral role in the Canadian economy, and there's a growing emphasis on providing them with more support and funding opportunities at all different levels of government. Thank you so much for listening today. And if you have any questions, please save them for our Q&A section. And next, I'm going to be passing it off to Ms. Stephanie Perrin.
Thank you, Rachel. My name is Stephanie Perrin, and I'm the Gender Equity and Social Inclusion Specialist with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And I will be sharing a presentation discussing Canada's approach an overview of barriers for MSMEs led by underrepresented groups in trade. This presentation will discuss Canada's approach to trade and gender, trade and Indigenous peoples, the barriers faced by women and Indigenous peoples, and key programs and international initiatives aiming to address those barriers. Next slide, please. So let's start with Canada's approach, which has endeavored to address these barriers through two avenues. At the national level, Canada has integrated trade, gender, and Indigenous peoples into its inclusive trade agenda, and these are among the areas highlighted in the Canada-ASEAN negotiations. At the sub-national or provincial level, Canadian provinces have their respective policies and programs that aim to strengthen MSME growth and participation in export. Civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations have also created programs targeted at underrepresented groups to assist and encourage them in trade. Next slide, please. The connection between trade and gender can be explored from an economic standpoint. The advancement of gender equality would add 150 billion Canadian to Canada's GDP by 2026. And women-owned businesses contribute 150 billion to Canada's economy while employing over 1.5 million people. Regarding Canada's approach to trade and gender, tools used by the Government of Canada include gender mainstreaming, a strategy to analyze the impacts and implications of actions, policies, or programs on diverse groups of women and men, as well as Gender-Based Analysis Plus, which was mentioned earlier, a methodology used by the Government of Canada to assess the socioeconomic impacts of its policies and programs on diverse groups of women and men. For example, GBA Plus is used to analyze FTA chapters and inform ongoing negotiations, such as the Canada-Mercosur FTA negotiations. In terms of actions, there are standalone chapters on trade and gender. For example, the Modernized Canada-Chile FTA and Modernized Canada-Israel FTA. These standalone chapters acknowledge the importance of gender equality and inclusive economic growth, reaffirm the parties' existing commitments to international agreements, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, lay out cooperation activities to encourage women's economic participation, and establish a trade and gender committee. There are also gender-related provisions throughout FTAs in chapters such as labor, investment, and cross-border trade. For example, gender provisions in a government procurement chapter provide opportunities for women-owned SMEs and other small and minority-owned businesses to be considered by procuring entities. Next slide, please. Specific approaches, barriers, and policy solutions are largely dependent on the context of the country or economy where Indigenous peoples are located. We'll move on to a discussion now on that topic. We recognize that there is no internationally agreed upon definition of what constitutes Indigenous peoples or ethnic minorities. Differing definitions and treatment of Indigenous peoples may result in differing approaches, barriers, and policy solutions. This presentation draws on the experiences of Indigenous peoples in Canada, which can then be referred to by other countries or economies. In Canada, there are 3 federally recognized groups of Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples recognized in the Canadian Constitution: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Regarding trade and Indigenous peoples in Canada, the federal government has also committed to advancing policies and programs that provide opportunities for Indigenous-led businesses to take advantage of the benefits from trade. So let's discuss Canada's 2-track approach. The first approach is to ensure that obligations to Indigenous peoples in the Canadian Constitution cannot be superseded or undermined by its commitments in an FTA. The second approach is to pursue FTA provisions to prioritize issues related to Indigenous peoples and ensure that these provisions acknowledge the importance of promoting Indigenous participation in trade, reaffirm international instruments such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, recognize the important role of the environment in the economic, social, and cultural well-being of Indigenous peoples, facilitate cooperation activities between the parties, such as establishing a dedicated website to provide Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses with information on an agreement, and lastly, establish a mechanism under an agreement to determine and facilitate these cooperation activities. Canada has also established a trade-focused Indigenous working group to engage with national Indigenous organizations, modern treaty and self-government partners, Indigenous groups and business associations, and legal and policy experts on trade and investment issues related to Indigenous peoples in Canada. Next slide, please. Returning to women entrepreneurs in trade, we'll take a look at some barriers that women entrepreneurs and women-led MSMEs often face. Restrictive gender roles lead to women being discouraged from entering business, politics, and STEM. In the private sector, many women experience gender discrimination. For example, microaggressions, lack of wage parity, sexual harassment, and other forms of sexism. Women may also face violence and harassment, especially when traveling outside of Canada and at border crossings. Women often lack access to formal financing due to lack of knowledge, lack of collateral to finance loans, and dependence on informal financing from family and friends. Lack of access to education and knowledge is another barrier for women. A related challenge is poor access to networks and mentorship to learn how to start, manage, and grow their business. Unequal distribution of domestic labor is one of the greatest barriers for women entrepreneurs. This has been especially challenging during the COVID-19 pandemic, where women have faced a disproportionate impact in terms of the unequal division of domestic labor. More so than men, women entrepreneurs need to balance household and family responsibilities with their business. As a result of these barriers, women-led MSMEs tend to be firms that are smaller in size on average. Women-led MSMEs are often survival-oriented businesses rather than wealth accumulation-oriented firms, which leads to lower revenue growth compared to businesses owned by men. Women-led MSMEs also tend to be concentrated in non-export facing sectors, such as services, education, healthcare, social assistance, arts, entertainment, and recreation. This is due to lower startup costs compared to sectors that are export facing, such as construction, transportation, warehousing, high technology manufacturing, and knowledge intensive sectors. Women entrepreneurs also tend to run lower value added firms and are less likely to run high value added and growth oriented businesses. Next slide, please. Returning to Indigenous peoples in entrepreneurship, they do face similar barriers to women and other underrepresented groups. They also face specific challenges, and the extent of those challenges varies among Indigenous groups in Canada. To begin, discrimination is a major barrier for Indigenous entrepreneurs, which can negatively impact access to employment and other opportunities. According to a 2019 Statistics Canada survey, discrimination is more common towards the Indigenous population compared to non-Indigenous populations. Indigenous peoples often have limited access to high-quality, inclusive education and face language barriers due to limited support in education services, particularly for schools located on Indigenous reserves compared to those off reserve. Difficulty accessing financing, equity, and capital is one of the most reported obstacles faced by Indigenous entrepreneurs. Reasons include lack of collateral, inability to use reserve lands as collateral, infrastructural barriers, and lack of trust in financial institutions due to racism and discrimination. Indigenous entrepreneurs may be dependent on informal financing from close networks to secure funding. Indigenous peoples often have a lack of employment opportunities and typically have lower employment rates than non-Indigenous populations. Lower employment levels are connected to lower levels of skills and training necessary to run an MSME. A lack of infrastructure is often a barrier for the many Indigenous peoples who live on traditional lands, reserves, and remote and rural communities. Indigenous MSMEs that export have reported that unreliable internet, telephone, IT technologies, electricity, water, and roads are obstacles to their growth. This barrier is reported at a higher rate compared to non-Indigenous-led MSMEs. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about key programs for women entrepreneurs. In 2018, under the Administration of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada, the federal government launched the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy, which includes 3 main components that offer funding, capacity strengthening, network support, and knowledge sharing. These programs are the Women Entrepreneurship Fund, the Women Entrepreneurship Strategy Ecosystem Fund, and the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. Businesses and non-governmental organizations provide other province-specific, regional, and international programs to offer additional support to women entrepreneurs through tools, community building, advisory services, training, mentoring, and connections with international opportunities, including markets in Asia. Next slide, please. Next, we have key programs for Indigenous entrepreneurs, which you can see listed on the slide here. These programs aim to facilitate Indigenous entrepreneurship and reduce barriers through a variety of approaches, including financial relief during the pandemic, supports for exporting and capital and business opportunities, improved recognition and access to Indigenous businesses, boosted coordination between federal partners and Indigenous communities, as well as exchange programs and guidebooks to connect Indigenous business professionals globally. Next slide, please. Canada's participation in international forums and initiatives also contributes toward tackling barriers for underrepresented groups in trade. Notable examples include the La Serena Roadmap for Women and Inclusive Growth, an APEC framework that was led by Chile in its hosting year in 2019. It identifies priority areas for promotion of gender equality across the Asia Pacific. The roadmap is informed by Canada's GBA Plus analysis, with the 5th area focusing on advancing women's economic empowerment through data collection and analysis. The Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Arrangement is an initiative led by New Zealand in its 2021 APEC hosting year, with the aim of strengthening the economic empowerment of Indigenous peoples in the Asia Pacific region. Current economies participating include Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Taiwan. The United States, Peru, and Chile are looking at this trade opportunity as well. We can also look at opportunities in international forums. Some economies hold membership in both ASEAN and APEC, namely Brunei Darussalam, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Their involvement in other multilateral frameworks such as APEC can provide opportunities to share and integrate practices that help achieve the common goals of economic and social development. Canada's commitment to opportunities for women and Indigenous peoples is further strengthened through regular interaction and the endorsement of global frameworks using these consensus-based decision-making models. That's it for my presentation. Thank you all very much for your time, and I will now pass it back to Justin.
Perfect. Thank you, Stephanie, for that really comprehensive overview on barriers that MSMEs led by underrepresented groups face here in Canada. And of course, thank you to all of our speakers thus far for your presentations. At this point, what I would like to do is to take a 10-minute break before we move on to the discussion portion of the workshop. But before we do, I would like to ask everyone to fill out a very short survey from the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development. This survey is very important in understanding the reach of this project and to help bring similar future programming from funders. And so a link should be in the chat box where you can access the survey. So we thank everyone in advance for taking the time to do this, and we look forward to seeing everyone in about 10 minutes. So that way then we can answer all the questions that you have. So we'll see you very soon. Hello, everyone, and welcome back from the break. We're just over halfway through our session as we move towards our Q&A period. But before we do, what I'd like to do is to provide a quick summary of today's discussion by sharing an overview of some of the resources for promoting MSMEs in trade, which are also aligned with Canada's inclusive trade agenda. If we could go to the next slide, please. So in our report, which is now available at the URL on your screen and should be appearing in the chat box in just a moment, there are 3 main chapters that you can refer to, and the presentations today mirror these sections, but with the caveat, of course, that the report goes into further detail that we weren't able to cover entirely in today's workshop. And so this includes a detailed examination of MSME-related provisions in Canada's regional and bilateral free trade agreements, case studies on the usage of gender-based plus analysis in Canada's trade negotiations, an overview of key environmental provisions for MSMEs, federal and provincial programs in Canada that support MSMEs, and key examples of promotion of MSMEs, gender, and Indigenous peoples in Canadian FTAs. So many of the presenters you saw here today were the authors of those sections. So aligned with their presentations, there are a few items I'd like to go over, which will hopefully spark a few more questions during the Q&A period. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So from chapter 1, I wanted to highlight some of the deeper dives that we take into agreements such as the CPTPP, CETA, and CUSMA, as well as other bilateral agreements that Sylvia and David mentioned. And in particular, we also have a very comprehensive section written by the team on environmental provisions. And so we touched on a comparison of these environmental provisions between CPTPP, CETA, and CUSMA, but there are a few more sections that we wish that we could have focused on, but want to mention quickly here, which include environmental concerns for MSMEs, multilateral environmental agreements that Canada has signed, and other voluntary commitments such as the SME Climate Hub, corporate social responsibility, and other voluntary sustainability standards that are relevant to the Canadian context. So on your screen, the page numbers are listed on the slide, so that way then you can cross-reference them with the sections in the report. Next slide, please. So in addition, we then went into chapter 2, which goes into greater detail about all of the programs that Rachel mentioned in her presentation, providing more details and resources on where to find information about federal Canadian government programs, provincial programs that have MSME mandates, and then of course, other specific organizations that we sought to highlight in our report and in the presentation. And I just wanted to quickly note that there's a very nice table here that summarizes the provincial programs that are within the report. And again, the page numbers are located on the slide, so you can easily reference that in the report. Next slide, please. And then finally, as Stephanie mentioned, gender equity and social inclusion are key parts of Canada's feminist international assistance policy and Canada's increasingly progressive trade agenda. And so to help you think through the Canadian approach to these topics, in addition to the 3rd chapter of the report, we have provided a gender equity and social inclusion checklist that you can take back with you and apply to your work. So if this is of further interest, we'd be more than happy to talk a little bit more about how to use this checklist in the Q&A session. Next slide, please. And then finally, if you look at the annex of this publication, we have several additional materials and resources that we've compiled for you. And so this includes many provisions from different agreements we have compiled, additional web and learning resources, and a chart that easily compares the technical definitions of MSMEs in Canada and ASEAN. And that's something that David had mentioned in his presentation. Another item that David also mentioned was that there was a working Excel document where you can sort and filter at your convenience all the different trade agreements that include MSME provisions by certain themes. So at that link, you'll be able to download that Excel file and manipulate it in ways that will be useful for your work. So by highlighting some of the ways in which you can use a report, we hope that it is useful for your future work moving forward. And so I'd like to now pass the floor back to Anastasia to share some final thoughts right before we enter into our Q&A session. So Anastasia, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, for the beautiful presentations. I'm just going to give a bit of context and a food for thought for the discussion. So just quickly going back to the definition of the progressive trade, in academia, most of the scholars suggest that there's no single definition. And whenever you go into negotiation, there could be inclusion of labor rights, environmental commitments, gender issues, indigenous rights might be discussed, as well as governance issues broadly defined. We saw from today's presentation that Canadian definition really emphasizes the segments of society that may take advantage of free trade agreements, such as women, Indigenous people, youth, and small and medium-sized enterprises. This is based on the definition, for example, from Government of Canada 2017. However, language might be generally aspirational and sometimes non-binding, and that depends on the way negotiation goes on. And so in the next slide, we would kind of go into why progressive trade now, and that could be an interesting area to understand and explore the issues that we have discussed today. So the goal or the course of the movement toward progressive trade comes from the rise of global anti-globalization sentiment. And what I mean by that is the domestic opposition to free trade agreements or regional free trade agreements. So in the US, you might have seen President Trump pulling out from TPP, trying to successfully renegotiating Canada, US, and Mexico trade agreements, or CUSMA. And Europe, you saw Brexit, so UK trying to regain its ability to set policy by withdrawing from the European Union, as well as we have multiple protests in the EU, in countries such as Germany, to try to regain their ability to set agenda and regain their sovereign power by pushing against FTAs. And they did sign them because of the integration, some of the progressive trade clauses that you saw. And one of the issues that Steph has highlighted in her presentation for Canada increasingly has been to keep and protect its Indigenous peoples. And this comes from a domestic report on Indigenous reconciliation in Canada that has been concluded in 2015 and goes to basically say that Canada would have reservation to protect the rights and privileges of Indigenous nations. So there could be Indigenous carve-outs and protections in recent treaties, and we can discuss them later on. And it's not something new that Canada has come across. It's parallels global trends such as the inclusive trade in WTO, or EU's idea of trade sustainability. So it's becoming a more mainstream approach to trade. And so with the ideas being not have just only economic benefits of trade, but also ensure that it's fair and inclusive. And with that, I'd like to return into Justin and get us to Q&A and try to get deeper and understand your questions and help you out answer them. So Justin, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anastasia, for that overview. And I think with all the information provided today, we have just about 10 minutes to answer some questions from our audience. But what I would like to do is actually to extend that time by just an extra 5 or 10 minutes if people are still available, just to ensure that we can answer all of your questions. So if we could have all of our wonderful panelists come back online with their cameras on. Perfect. So welcome back, everybody. So from the registration, I see we already have a few questions that have been raised. And so I'd like to start off with those with our discussion. But audience members, please feel free to use the chat function or to use the raise your hand function to ask questions. And someone from our team will be able to let me know, and I'll be able to call upon you. So looking back at some of the registration questions we received from registration, one of them was, how are MSMEs linked to Canada's various industries, and which sector or sectors matter the most to the Canadian market? And then we received another question, a follow-up question from somebody else, which complements this question very nicely, which is, what percentage of MSME trade in Canada comes from MSMEs? So David, maybe I'll turn to you to start us off with the answers to that question. And then other panelists, please feel free to add if they would like to add anything else.
Thank you, Justin. So as I mentioned, Canada is a federation and is a very big country. So when you look at the Canadian context, it might not be the same for an individual province. So I'll just start off with Canada's major export categories, and I'll go into the MSME area. So 14% of our exports are crude oil. And then if you add cars and car parts, that comes up to 10%, gold 4%, wood 2%. So you'll often see this mix between a huge amount of natural resources and a huge amount of manufacturing. And particularly that space where natural resources get upgraded in some manufacturing product, you'll generally see that. Canada also has a very large services sector, about 70 to 80% of the economy in terms of employment numbers. So the way MSMEs interact with trade is obviously two ways. One, directly by selling abroad, and two, indirectly by selling to larger companies that then sell. And so I'll start off with the direct stuff. We unfortunately only have information on goods exports. We don't have services on this level. So goods, you're looking at about 40% of exports originating from MSMEs, and then the number in terms of registered companies exporting, it's about 90% of companies. So it goes way up there. So it's a very significant contributor. Now, the reason why I mentioned services is some of you might be aware of an analysis called global value chains, and I'm not going to take you through the wonderful thing. Personally, as an economist, I think it's the worst marketing job we've done. But if you look at value-added exports, which is the assist that is going on inside Canada to exports that go abroad, services actually come off as the dominant category, somewhere between 40 to 50%. So unfortunately, we don't have data about sectors and MSMEs. And so, but the reality is that it'd be very evident in those large sectors, you would see the MSMEs performing on natural resources. My home province is a major exporter of seafood, so every little fisherman catching lobster is probably captured in the Canadian statistics as an exporter, because we export lobster to the world. Lobster for us is barbecue here. So yeah, that's my answer.
Perfect. Thank you, David. Would anybody else like to add anything to that? Otherwise, I could go to the next question. No? Okay, so I'm just going through the list, and we did receive a very good question earlier in the session from Cambodia. And that is, what do you mean or refer to sets of activities on the term government procurement? And David, I believe this question came during your presentation. And then another view being shared from Cambodia is that Indonesia has requested to omit the word indigenous in the draft text for the negotiation. However, it has been noted that Canada's focus is to improve the trade for indigenous peoples. So I guess the question to our panelist is, it'd be great if we could discuss the difference on the word indigenous, and maybe Stephanie from a technical definition, or from a nomenclature kind of organization, or Anastasia. And then perhaps I could turn the question to you, David, about that term government procurement. So a few questions there. Would anybody like to start first? Stephanie, I know you talked a little bit about this in your presentation about some of the technical terms and definitions. Do we just want to maybe go back to that and just do a quick overview of that?
Sure, yeah, and if anyone else has a perspective they would like to offer on this, please jump in. But I would, I think just reiterate, the complexities of language, and we recognize that there is no agreed upon definition for what constitutes Indigenous peoples or ethnic minorities, and that due to complexities in language and context, that those different settings will result in different approaches and barriers and policy solutions. And I see that there was a response in the chat that perhaps this question was covered, so I'll just I won't speak about it too much longer. But in the Canadian context, we do have three different categories, being First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and I recognize that in other economies and countries that there would similarly be much more granularity to those categories and groups of Indigenous peoples. So I'll leave it there and won't take up too much more time with that. Thank you for the question.
I'll just piggyback on the Indigenous discussion, because there's an issue. I don't think anyone would disagree with the statement that Indonesians are Indigenous to Indonesia. And so that's a valid statement. The problem in Canada, by my last name, which is Hamilton, I'm not Indigenous to Canada. And so, as we mentioned, there are efforts about reconciliation. And so there was actually a whole finding we set up a whole process called the Truth and Reconciliation process, and the result of that finding was, I'll use the word genocide, and that's the government's point of view. So it's trying to maintain the policy space to properly resolve, and it will take a long time to resolve. But that's the Canadian position on the Indigenous issue. It's not trying to steal someone else's identity. It's trying to make sure that we maintain the policy space. On SMEs and government procurement, so frequently you'll see in our agreements in our table that we provided to you, there might be carve-outs or things like that for SMEs that basically make a special area of government procurement or part of a contract, or maybe it might be a performance requirement in government procurement that you work with a certain amount of SMEs or disclose whether you're not going to. So there's a different bunch. I would recommend going through the agreement or going through the data, but there are provisions there that make allowances for the inclusion of SMEs and might actually create a performance requirement in the government procurement process.
Perfect. Thank you, David. And thank you, Stephanie, for answering that first round. I see there's another round of questions, and this time it's from Malaysia. And so Malaysia writes, thank you for sharing. It's no secret that governments spend a lot of resources and years of effort to negotiate trade agreements and always look for room for improvement, i.e. new areas of provisions. And nevertheless, as the saying goes, the success of any policy lies in its implementation. And so we have a few questions. One is what FTA success looks like to Canada in the MSME context. That's one. Second is, are there any KPIs and how are these KPIs monitored? And then just one further comment, there are often gray areas in the integration of MSMEs in international trade, probably due to structural challenges and to a certain extent, silo approaches in steering overall MSME development. So i.e. trade matters are under the Ministry of Trade and development strategies lie under different ministries. So could our panelists share some ideas on practical ideas to mitigate some of these issues? So a lot of questions there, a few tricky ones, but I see some of our panelists smiling. And I'm just wondering, David, do you want to go first? And perhaps maybe Anastasia or Sylvia, if you would like to add anything after that.
Okay, I'll jump in. So what does success look like, MSMEs and KPIs? I mean, you're speaking my language, and I would love to see more KPIs. Of course, the difficulty with any sort of international KPIs is you're into that issue about the definition of MSMEs. What I can speak from is our own provincial context, is I'm a provincial civil servant. And so I have to integrate with the federal guys, but I also have a whole provincial administration that I'm also responsible for, or responsible to work with, and be more appropriate to say. So we have a business promotion group here that monitors and helps SMEs. So I guess the answer on KPIs I think it would differ across provinces, because there's a federal definition of what is an SME, and then every province has its own definition of what is an SME. So that could also change too. This gets into a much larger discussion, because really what we're talking about is, I guess I'm going to call it reverse competition policies. Competition policy or antitrust law, you're worrying about things being too big. This is about including things that are small, and so it's the other end of the spectrum. So it's particularly in trade where size matters and in terms of advantage. This has become an issue, but as I said, trade agreements enter into our framework as pieces of public legislation, so we can't legally make an exclusion. And if they are being excluded, it's actually we have a responsibility to find ways to resolve that, because they're not supposed to be excluded. So, I mean, we could have a whole seminar on this, and these are the same discussions happening at the WTO and other fora. The simple answer is right now, it's basically for us here domestically in Nova Scotia, there's our definition, does that business qualify under the KPI? And then we look at the percentage of where they're exporting and also where they're exporting to, because there's a need to diversify our trade away from the United States, particularly after the whole experience with the Trump administration, to make sure we're not too vulnerable. There are structural elements, and I think that kind of highlights the need to include this stuff in a dedicated chapter in the free trade agreements, because you need that committee, because the fact is they can be nuanced, and so you need a group of bodies of human beings to actually look at nuance, because sometimes it might be an issue on TBT, it might be an issue on rules of origin, trade facilitation. So it's better to have a working group of people dedicated to looking at this. So yeah, that's my only answer to the structural issue.
We do have, I see quite a few number of additional questions coming in through the chat box. So just want to see if any other panelists wanted to add anything to that. Otherwise, I can go to some additional questions from Cambodia and Indonesia. Okay, so we have another great question from Cambodia about MSMEs in Cambodia. And that question is, how would we best explore the cooperation with various Canadian agencies on supporting Cambodia to their journey on promotion of inclusive businesses, which has now become a very attractive topic for addressing social issues. So that's one. I'll do this as a bit of a lightning round so that way then we can get through all the questions. Another question we have from Indonesia is, one, are the Indigenous and gender elements incorporated specifically in the SME chapter of Canada's FTAs? And if so, in what form? And then two, based on Canada's experience, what is the best approach to increase SME participation in the global value chain? So quite a number of questions there. Sylvia, maybe I'll start with you because in your discussion, you had talked about some of the modernized trade agreements and dedicated gender chapters. Do you think you could maybe speak to some of the questions from Indonesia, and then I can open the floor to the questions from Cambodia?
Sure. So the Indigenous chapters, so far Canada has not included a model Indigenous chapter in none of their agreement that they have negotiated. So the SME chapters is usually a standalone chapter on its own, and it talks about how the e-commerce provisions can be, how e-commerce can be used for SMEs, and they also talk about how information sharing might benefit SMEs. And also these provisions, these chapters talk about how establishing a committee might help the MSMEs to kind of explore the benefit of trade. That is a great segue to the second question, that is based on Canada's experience, what is the best approach? So in all of the SME chapters negotiated by Canadian FTAs, they have always mentioned that establishing a committee and then collaborate or cooperate on areas such as capacity building training and support groups and other lots of activities that we have mentioned in detail in our report. And those are some of the things, activities that are suggested to SMEs. So yeah, coming back to the first question, is that the SME chapters and the gender chapter is totally different chapters. It's usually termed as trade and SME, trade and gender. And there is, so far there we don't have a trade and engineers chapter. So yeah.
Perfect, thank you, Sylvia. That second question from Indonesia, based on Canada's experience, what is the best approach to increase SME participation? Rachel, we talked a little bit about this in your section about lessons that can be learned from Canadian programs and policies for MSMEs. For example, provincial level programs, and whether or not there might be a similar approach from ASEAN member states. It's a bit of a different take on the question, but I'm wondering if you could offer any thoughts on that.
The best way that Canada has really tried to increase participation in global value chains has been basically by supporting the Canadian MSMEs with funding, particularly through loan programs. The ones that I discussed are more startup oriented, but Business Development Canada and Export Development Canada have further loan programs that can help aid businesses in further expansion, as well as Export Development Canada has a series of other programs that can aid in ensuring exports and allowing businesses to grow organically that way. Some of them have different tiers that scale with the way that businesses grow. The credit program at Export Development Canada has certain requirements for the business to meet certain targets, such as revenue, number of employees, and so on. So as these businesses can grow, so do the programs that they have available to them. So by having programs kind of through from startup all the way to like full global trading, it allows businesses to kind of expand gradually and to have support at every stage. So that's really, I think, the best way to support SMEs to really integrate into global supply chains or global value chains is by providing them with kind of constant support that they can access as needed.
Thanks, Rachel. And I think chapter 2 of the report also talks a little bit about this. And so just going back to Cambodia's question about how we can explore cooperation, I think understanding some of the models of the different programs that happen in Canada at both the federal and provincial level and the replicability of some of those programs, especially to the ASEAN context, would be particularly important in finding common ground and mutual areas of understanding. So I definitely think that looking at the report and going into some of those sections will try to help identify some of those initial points that both sides can look at. I'm cognizant of time and where we are. So as the moderator, I will use my powers to ask all of our panelists in the lightning round one last final question. And that would be if you could share with our audience one more sort of final critical lesson learned or additional piece of information from your presentation, what would that be? And so maybe Anastasia, could I start with you on that?
Yes, thank you, Justin. So the most critical lesson is the integration and incorporation of different interests and supports that's given to these communities. The carrots are there to support specific groups, whether they be MSME, whether they're indigenous groups, and really the inclusivity we're seeing with the pushback from deglobalization that we need to be more cognizant of the issues that are happening, and we need to integrate domestic issues and be cognizant of the ones of our international partners. So I think that the lesson learned is we need to negotiate and consider different groups and their interests and consult with them to be better able to accommodate them. So that's my take on it, and I'm happy to pass it on to Justin. Who do you have in mind for the next one?
Next, David, you're right in the middle of my screen, so perhaps maybe I could turn it to you for some final thoughts from your end.
For me, I'm simply going to have to praise previous work done at the WTO. The WTO Joint Initiative of MSMEs, and particularly with the data that we were able to get for them for free, and it's all available to everyone on the WTO website, and of course we've modified that table for you, was invaluable and gives you a high degree of granularity in enable us to get me to do a lot of work very quickly. And so the only thing I can say is the transparency aspect of the WTO in conjunction with this joint initiative, tremendously valuable. And for those of you that are participating as countries in that joint initiative, I think it might be important for you to get up and say that this actually happened. And when we set these systems up when I was there, I never had the intention that we used in such a context, but here it is being used in a tremendously valuable context that is supporting of both sides and very much supports the whole cooperative aspect and transparency aspect of the WTO.
Perfect. Thanks, David. And hopefully some of the officials will be seeing you very soon, potentially in Ottawa. Steph, let me turn to you about your chapter on barriers for underrepresented groups. Any final thoughts on that you'd like to share with our audience?
I'll keep it quick and encourage everyone to take a look at the gender equity and social inclusion framework that's included in the report and consider how it may apply to the work that you do in your context. And thank you all for attending. And Justin, I'll pass it right back to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Steph. Rachel, I know we just talked a little bit about programs and replicability, but any other final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think the final thought I have is the resources provided in the report do a really good job of helping you understand what the kind of Canadian context is. Canada is such a large country and there's so much variation at the provincial level that for an outsider to really get a grasp of it could be quite difficult. So I think that the work that I've done, and as well as the other people in this group, we've really broken that down and made it understandable and clear, and hopefully it will aid in the future negotiations.
Perfect. Thanks, Rachel. Sylvia, you have the last word. Any final takes for our audience here?
Yeah, first of all, thank you everyone for attending and participating. And one word would be that Canadian trade priorities has been evolving in the past 5 years, and it will keep evolving. At the same time, we're seeing that ASEAN's trade priorities are also evolving. It's becoming more inclusive by including chapters like MSMEs for the very first time in their RCEP negotiation. So in our report, we have tried to explore these angles, these nuances, that how we have more in similarities than in differences. And I would request everyone to take a look at the report, and maybe it would be really useful to you for the further negotiation process. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Sylvia. So that wraps up our Q&A for today. Thank you to everybody for your questions and to our speakers and for engaging in today's workshop. If you do have any other lingering questions on the materials presented today, please do not hesitate to reach out to us through our email on the screen, info@asiapacific.ca, and we'd be more than happy to answer them via email over the next few weeks. This is something we're doing to make sure that we cover all of the questions. So once again, we'd like to thank Global Affairs Canada for funding this technical assistance project through the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development. And thank you to the implementing organizations of the EDM, which are Cowater International and the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. And then finally, on behalf of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, we would like to thank all of our presenters who took the time to speak to us today from all parts of the country across multiple time zones. And then of course, thank you to our audience for attending today's session. So until we meet again, my name is Justin Kwan, and I hope that all of you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.